Hi, and welcome back to Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy, where today we are going to look at the Declaration of Independence. So in some of our last lessons and videos, we discussed the events leading up to the Revolutionary War, which the Declaration really helps kick off. And we talked about the Continental Congresses. The first Continental Congress took place in 1774, and most of the 13 colonies at this point were really not looking to declare their independence from Great Britain yet. They were just mad at the British about taxes and their lack of representation in Parliament. They were mad at the presence of British soldiers on the American continent, leading to events like the Boston Massacre. So the First Continental Congress wanted to resolve things peacefully and sent King George III a petition for a redress of their grievances. And grievances, as you remember, are complaints. Before the delegates returned home, they made plan to meet the following summer if nothing was done. And, well, King George, of course, blew off their petition. Meanwhile, while the delegates might have been hoping to resolve their issues with the British peacefully, things in Massachusetts were turning violent. We looked at the battles of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775 in our part 1 of the American Revolution. So check that out if you haven't already. And the violence escalated further with the Battle of Bunker Hill, which we covered in that video as well. As events looked increasingly like war was inevitable, the delegates returned to Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress, with delegates who we now cherish as our founding fathers: Benjamin Franklin, John and Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, and George Washington. The Congress had many pressing things to consider. They started by choosing John Hancock from Massachusetts as the president of the Congress. Hancock was a wealthy merchant from Boston who had funded the Sons of Liberty and had been an outspoken advocate against British injustices. The Congress also created a Continental Army and unanimously chose the hero of the French and Indian War, George Washington, to be the commander of this newly formed Continental Army. So Washington rushed off to Boston right away to take control of the troops surrounding the city. The Congress offered Britain one last chance to avoid war, sending King George III what became known as the Olive Branch Petition, stating that they still wanted peace. However, once again, the king rejected their petition. While the Continental Congress was awaiting the king's response, a writer named Thomas Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense, which became a huge sensation throughout the colonies. Paine's Common Sense explained the reasons for the colonies to cut their ties with the British, and this influenced many colonists to join the cause of rebellion. As debate at the Congress heated up about whether to declare themselves independent of Great Britain or not, the well-respected delegate from Virginia, Richard Henry Lee, introduced a resolution for independence, which stated, quote, that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved. As the remaining delegates debated Lee's resolution, they chose a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence, including John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. And this brings us to our question of what you need to know about this incredible document. Well, almost all U.S. history classes want you to place the document in the context of the causes and events leading up to the Revolutionary War. Many will want you to know the people and ideas involved, as well as inspirations Thomas Jefferson looked to when he placed the ideas of rights and purposes of government in this remarkable document. And just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with a variety of resources are available at Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers by clicking the link in the notes below this video. The committee chosen to draft the Declaration of Independence picked Thomas Jefferson to do the writing. So why Thomas Jefferson? After all, Jefferson, a mere 33-year-old unknown delegate, lacked the prestige of many of the other delegates. Well, he was chosen for a couple of reasons. One, he was a Virginian, and many of the colonies knew of the troubles in Massachusetts, centered around Boston. And while they were upset about the taxes and the way that Massachusetts was being treated, they hadn't yet suffered direct military conflict with Britain. In other words, some of them saw this as a Massachusetts problem. Secondly, Jefferson was known to be an extremely bright individual with exceptional writing skills. As John Adams reportedly told Jefferson, "Reason first, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear to be at the head of this business. Reason second, I am obnoxious and unpopular. Reason third, you can write 10 times better than I can." So where did Jefferson look to for inspiration? Well, Jefferson drew on the writings of Enlightenment philosopher John Locke from the 1690s. Locke wrote that people are born with natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and that people create governments to protect these rights. As Jefferson was drafting the Declaration, word of the Battle of Bunker Hill had reached the delegates, and on July 2nd, 1776, the Second Continental Congress voted yes on Lee's resolution for independence. This vote was a serious development, and some, like John Adams, thought that this was the moment that should be celebrated as Independence Day. Adams, in a letter to his wife, wrote that, quote, "The second day of July of 1776 will be the most memorable in the history of America. It ought to be celebrated with parade, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of the continent to the other forevermore." Well, he was close. July 4th, 1776 is the day that we celebrate. And this is the day that, after making some revisions to Jefferson's text, the Congress approved his Declaration of Independence. And again, this is the day we celebrate our independence. So this was a serious event. The delegates knew that by signing their names to the document, they were committing treason against Great Britain. John Hancock, in response to his large and memorable signature, reportedly said, "There, I guess King George will be able to read that without his spectacles." Noting the seriousness of the act that they had committed, Benjamin Franklin reportedly said that, quote, "We must all hang together, or assuredly we shall all hang separately." So some states will ask you to identify the different sections and language of this document, and I have a much more in-depth look at the document itself in an additional video I have called the Declaration of Independence, Civics EOC. If your teacher wants you to elaborate on the language of the document, check that out. For our overview, you should know that the document is divided into 4 sections. A preamble, which states that the people who want to form a new country should explain their reasons for doing so. There's a natural rights section, which lists the rights that, quote, "the people should have and the principles governments should be based on." A grievances section, which lists the complaints against Great Britain and the King of England. And the conclusion announcing the creation of a new nation, the United States. This document contains one of the most quoted and memorable sentences in U.S. history.
"We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream."
Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Most of the grievances in the Declaration were addressed to the king for, quote, "cutting off trade with all parts of the world, imposing taxes on us without our consent, ignoring petitions for redresses of grievances." And again, a lot of these were directly aimed at the king. The conclusion announced that, quote, "We therefore do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is, and ought to be, totally dissolved." Copies of the Declaration were sent out to the newly declared states, and public readings were celebrated. George Washington read a copy to his troops on July 9th in Worcester, Massachusetts, leading to, quote, repeated cheers, firing of muskets and cannon, bonfires and demonstrations. But Washington knew that this was just the beginning, and that a long fight with the British was just getting underway. And that's where we will pick up next time for our U.S. history classes, as we continue to look at the American Revolutionary War. But before we do, let's review. These battles, covered in our previous video, were the, quote, first shots of the Revolutionary War and came before the Declaration of Independence. Lexington and Concord. What preparations did the Second Continental Congress make in case of hostilities? Well, they created a Continental Army, they appointed George Washington the commander of the army, and I should add that they encouraged the states to establish militias. What was the Olive Branch Petition? This was a last-ditch attempt to keep the peace with Great Britain. This writer published a popular pamphlet describing why the colonists should declare their independence. Thomas Paine. What delegates were chosen to draft the Declaration of Independence? John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. Who was chosen to write the draft of the Declaration? Well, that would be TJ, Thomas Jefferson. What was one reason Adams thought Jefferson should write the Declaration? He was a Virginian. He also thought he was smarter than he was and a better writer. What date did the delegates vote to adopt the Declaration? July 2nd, 1776. What date did Congress agree to the Declaration? July 4th, 1776. What three rights did Jefferson say all people were entitled to? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What would Jefferson and Locke say the purpose of the government is? To protect our natural rights. What did Jefferson say the people could do if governments abuse these rights? Alter or abolish and institute new ones. The grievances section of the Declaration was about complaints addressed to the king. And that is it. I want to thank you guys for watching. Be sure to subscribe because up next we are going to continue looking at the Revolutionary War. Just a reminder, teachers, that this PowerPoint with worksheets, quizzes, smartboard files, lesson plans, and additional activities are available at Teachers Pay Teachers. Click the link in the notes below this video or search for Mr. Raymond's Social Studies Academy at Teachers Pay Teachers.